Guys, I just want to, maybe we can clue our listeners into the debate that we just had, because I feel like it's very ordinary unhappiness for us to be celebrating 100 episodes, which, hey guys, 100 episodes.
Whee!
That's pretty cool.
Insert some sort of kazoo sound here.
We haven't like slaughtered each other yet. This is good. We made it. Our group therapy is panning out. But I think it's very us that we sat down and looked at this outline because, the listeners gave us some really good questions. And I think we landed on rather than cutting out questions, we wanted, I guess it's going to be 100 and 101 celebration.
Analysis terminable and interminable, baby.
Yep.
Well, they group kind of nicely. It's interesting to see how audiences have certain areas of focus that they want to explore and how some of those are more clinical and therapeutic or about topics in psychoanalysis, and then others are about psychoanalysis, broadly speaking, as it relates to other traditions of thought, specifically Marxism.
And you perverts all want to hear more about Lacan.
Yeah.
Perverts, complimentary.
Of course. We love perverts.
And then the other questions, which are ones which we probably wouldn't do a public episode on under any circumstance.
Yeah, for reasons. Yeah.
Though
That's why God invented paywalls. That's why Freud invented paywalls.
Well,
wait, no.
I was thinking about that quote of Freud's from the New Introductory Lectures of Psychoanalysis. He that has eyes to see and ears to hear may convince himself that no mortal can keep a secret. If his lips are silent, he chatters with his fingertips. Betrayal oozes out of him at every pore.
Yeah, if you want the ooze, you got to pay. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, but they're already getting the ooze too, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
like every
fair.
single take, no matter how edited, is gonna.
I think it's probably for the next
We're basically
episode.
making a podcast that is constantly Dora putting her finger in and out of the reticule over and over. I think that's where we first get the we betray ourselves rhetoric.
I think all of this episode 1 of the podcast wasn't one of our opening questions to ourselves about what is it to put yourself into the subject supposed to know position?
Yeah, it was
the
whole
fact that
episode.
we're making a podcast about this stuff is overdetermined from the jump.
Yes.
So it'll be fun to actually hash that out a little bit more. That's interesting. Although the question that we got proposes something that I'm vehemently against, but I'll wait. I'll wait until we actually get there.
We can take a first pass at it.
Yeah.
Are you guys anniversary celebration people also? I was thinking about this because we were talking with Sam Adler-Bell about vacation and being vacation people. And I was like, I am a vacation person, but I'm not an adult birthday person, celebration. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
You don't like joy.
I
I'm just kidding.
I like jouissance, Dan.
That's good. Can we differentiate? In my mind, I differentiate marking time, which I think is valuable, and I look for as many opportunities to do that. Because, you mark time, you can feel time going, time slows down a little bit, you live a little longer, at least subjectively. That's my running theory.
Mm-hmm.
So I like marking time. I do not like social obligation. And you notice none of us are exchanging gifts right now. This is my kind of anniversary. That's nice.
I have 2 thoughts to be on brand.
One.
At least 2 thoughts.
No, I got precisely 2 thoughts this time. One, it's my understanding from some recent reading I've been doing that...
Is this the Western esotericism
Yes,
shit?
it is. Yeah.
Oh, man.
That one of the things Satanists celebrate as a major holiday is the birthday, right? Because it's all about the self. So I'm just thinking about, Anton LaVey having a ice cream cake or something like that. That's, so there's that. I don't know. Take that any way you want. Let your decision be the whole of the law on that one.
Nice.
And then the second thing I was thinking about is a joke that I heard growing up, which is probably funnier in the original Polish, but I don't remember it. And it involves a guy going to a doctor's office. Guy goes into a doctor's office.
This isn't one of those Zizek jokes, is it?
No.
Okay, then yes, I want to hear it.
It's a joke about ideology. So a guy goes to see a doctor, and after doing some initial tests or whatever, the doctor re-enters the room with a clipboard. And he looks at the patient, looks at the clipboard, looks up at the patient and says, "How old are you again?" And the guy says, you can insert the age here. And the doctor nods, looks down at the clipboard and says, "That's about enough, isn't it?"
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I am Patrick Blanchfield.
I'm Dan Yowell.
And today we are celebrating our 100th episode with a mailbag.
Let's go.
Let's go. I am excited. Does anyone have any 100th episode reflections? First, have we learned anything about ourselves or otherwise?
I think we've learned that what makes the podcast possible and what is also very appropriately the fodder for this episode are the people who listen, who comment on Patreon and ask questions in the Discord.
Yes.
And it's really cool to have people on this open-ended, differently punctuated, multiple mini-series spawning off journey.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you feel?
Allergies are killing me.
No, I mean, yes, I know that your allergies are killing you.
Abby, how do you feel? How do you feel about this? What's your favorite part? Can we start? Let's be positive.
Yeah, I'll be positive and enthusiastic, both.
Nice.
No, I actually, I feel like in some ways I get the best of all of this, of all three of us, because I still have a salary job and I get to do this. But I really feel like at the risk of being sentimental, which Donald Winnicott cautions us against, this has been really revitalizing for me. Like this is a really tough time to be a teacher. And there's been something so incredible when you're in the business of convincing people that reading difficult and often old texts is a worthwhile pursuit, is a meaningful thing, to have helped to create something where we are constantly getting requests for more reading. And nice. To really like just the community on the Patreon, on the Discord. Can I tell you, like, and this I think maybe like really speaks to like who I am as a person. Here's the absolute, like the number one thing that has given me the most joy of all of the things that our listeners have brought to us. At some point in the because we have a Discord, join the Discord on Patreon. One of our listeners dropped in a PowerPoint that they made for the philosophy club at the high school where they teach. That was an introduction to Freud. And no joke, Patrick can attest to this. I am not a sentimental person. I legit teared up, not only because it was just this beautiful pedagogical object, but because I was like, oh, this is like why we do the things we do. And it also like really just, there's been so much of doing the show that has like made these other parts of my life like that seem disconnected feel really connected. Like, and it's, I don't know. That was something incredible. Was like just being like, was thinking about teenagers, like not my college students, but like teenagers that I've never met being introduced to Freud in this absolutely beautiful presentation. And I don't know, it gave me so much hope, which is frankly something that is in short supply these days.
And a philosopher feeling hope when their work is corrupting the youth is a rare thing too, isn't it? And then for Socrates,
bringing them the plague.
Yeah. I'll take a stab at this one too. I think this has been a joy. Some of the conversations we've had have been, real as fuck and have really sat with me. But part of what's been a joy about this is re-experiencing and experiencing in new ways the ways in which psychoanalytic material is just so goddamn weird. Right. And how it involves, we've phrased this as like these three domains of like, we're talking about like the clinical and ideas about pathology. We talk about like the metapsychological or like the broadly psychological construction of mind and ideas that are like, the unconscious, and they go much further than thinking about pathology. And then the third is like the applied, right? And the cultural criticism and the like.
Patrick's 3 baskets of psychoanalysis model.
Yeah.
Patent pending.
And you're always doing more than one, right? And whether it be a metaphor or, as we've been doing, like turning to popular texts. And in that way, like it's not necessarily even a body of knowledge or a set of terms or jargon that you can master, so much as it is a perspective and a capacity to think about things in different ways, or think about the same thing from different perspectives and see how the thing itself kind of shifts or how it implicates the perspective. And in that way, it's been a process of reacquainting me with part of what I fell in love with about psychoanalysis sort of as an adult, after periods of feeling sort of alienated from it and from writing in general and from reading and scholarship, which was that experience of getting academic training as a generalist, right? As a comparativist, as someone who, has
compares things to other things.
Yeah, that's my degree, right? It's a degree of comparing things. And
you're great at it, sweetie.
Thank you.
I love it when you compare things.
I won't say I'm incomparable at it, but I will say that. No, but like that, again, that's like a rare thing. Sorry. That's a rare thing in general these days. I think people don't have that opportunity. I'm blessed to have it. But I remember like at a certain point being not just like depressed emotionally, but like intellectually feeling kind of sterile, intellectually just bored. And again, I've alluded this before on the podcast, right? I know things are bad for me when things are boring. Right?
Yeah.
That's the warning sign. Like I can deal with horrible, horrible things.
That's true.
Provided there's still some degree of curiosity and interest and I can perceive patterns. But when I stop caring about that, or when that's when I know like I'm entering a bad period. But it was the experience of going from a really in-depth but still kind of antiseptic encounter with psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic critiques of literature, et cetera, in a liberal arts humanities PhD program, to simultaneously then literally crossing to the other side of campus, crossing a big highway to do clinical training and hear clinicians talk about their patients and get these texts, which were more than just like, written text, but like the retellings of things in case histories, that it not only it gave me this deep appreciation for what clinicians do, but for how individuals and, collectivities, communities are inexhaustibly full of meaning, right? And just rich, and they make their way through life, and they encounter structures and they live out structures, but they also change those structures, and not just institutions or, patterns of the way that the world is sort of divided under like capitalism or something, but it's like the way your meaning making process adds meaning to your life, and that you can surprise people, not just in how you interpret things, but how you live. And that I don't want to say that like the story of a person's life in psychoanalysis, as it was related by clinicians, like was like equivalent to like a high modernist novel or something, but that rather I suddenly found myself considering both those things, like artistic creativity and just like human survival and adaptation and resilience and tragedy, as having this kind of aura to them, right? Of being real in some way. And that attunement to like emergent meaning across cases, sometimes in high jargon, sometimes in high culture stuff, sometimes in low culture stuff, sometimes in just like the banalities of how people get out of bed in the morning or don't, was an exposure to a type of like emergent meaning making and to something in the human, a capacity that humans have and that we have quintessentially together, right? It's not a solitary activity that doing this podcast has reacquainted me with and continually brings home to me, whether we're talking about a movie or we're doing an interview with a clinician or we're thinking about politics. It's just, it's a way of thinking and a kind of openness to knowledge and collaboration that continually, it really does vivify me. Like it makes me feel more energetic. It gives me life.
You're here.
Thank you.
What about you, Dan?
Me? Well,
Dan doesn't like to talk about himself.
I really don't.
Yeah, but
although you guys you convince me to.
And
it's
you're
a lot of
all over
arm
this,
twisting.
Yeah. You create, talk about creation here, right? Like you package this in a way that this would not be coherent to anyone else.
I guess first
He's going to cut that out because it's nice. No, he has the power to do it.
First, I should say thank you to the audience for their patience with our audio quality. I feel like the last 100 episodes, if you go back and listen to episode 1 and compare it to episode 100, I feel like it's gotten a lot better. I know it's not perfect still working out some kinks with managing guests. I know we've gotten some complaints about guest audio quality being a little wonky, but we're trying to like walk that line between we want to talk to interesting people on terms that they're able to meet now and not have to wait 6 months to get potentially timely input on important things, and also making them like legible and pleasant to the ear. And it's kind of a tough line to walk. And for the most part, our audience is really patient. And the audience that isn't patient actually gives me legit good feedback. And we've been able to make improvements because, we're learning as we go along. So that's been really nice.
Good job avoiding anything impersonal.
Well, okay. All right. I'll say a personal thing.
I know that trick. I invented that trick.
Yeah, you guys are going to argue with me about this, but it's true. It's true from where I'm sitting. And that is, I see myself largely as part of the audience in this room. I know you guys are some of my closest friends. We tell each other a lot. We hang out on the porch like a couple of times a week, it feels like. It's nice. We all get along really well. But in this realm of like psychoanalysis, I do feel like a pupil still. And I think it's nice that I get to learn and create simultaneously. That's really edifying. I really enjoy that. And if it wasn't for that combination of things, if it was just creation, if it was just learning, I think I would have been bored by now.
Mm-hmm.
But that like swimming in that frothy milieu has kept me on board like really strongly. I'm on board. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been edifying.
I think
is that personal enough?
It's personal
That's
enough.
right.
And I think Dan, also what you just put your finger on, like in addition to working with students, is like that's the thing that keeps people in academia.
Yeah.
Is the promise of like you're actually learning stuff, like as you're like the creation and the learning.
Yeah, it's
like,
important.
It's a heady brew and one that will people will tolerate a lot of exploitation to be able to put that at the center of their lives.
I mean, I worked in corporate America for almost 17 years, and I learned pretty quickly that I'm not going to say the universal cure. For me, the cure to burnout, to just like psychic destruction, is creativity.
Yeah.
Like I would have to come home and be creative in some way. Otherwise, I would just die.
Yeah.
So to be able to find a place that I don't have to run from this and be creative elsewhere, I get to listen to my friends talk and find little moments that I can punctuate and make stand out and feel special. That's like, yeah, it's really rewarding to me. I enjoy it.
And you can't run away from us because we share a wall.
Yeah, that's true.
We're coming through it if you ever try to avoid it.
We have a knock
sledgehammer
code.
away in. Yeah.
Can you just clip in? I came in like a wrecking ball. Should we get to it, folks? All this talk about feelings is making me uncomfortable.
Gross.
Here, we'll thematize it by saying we've also made a lot of new friends, both interviewees and interlocutors and collaborators, but also with audience members, and have learned a lot and have been impelled to learn yet other things, and oftentimes to like realize what we don't know and do new research and try and have new guests on or read new books and stuff. And so it's with that kind of dual acknowledgement of the collectivity of creativity, that the fact that creativity is never on its own, and also with an openness to like, we'll be honest about what we don't know and what we're trying to learn more about. We'll field some of these questions that have been coming in.
Like every form of segue, I think we should lean into it. Like my segue pun?
I like that. That was good. I've never written that one of you.
Yeah. They're fun. They're fun. Yeah,
Okay,
you feel like a mall cop.
We're
It's
not
great.
putting that in the...
No segue bit?
No.
All right.
All right. Are we ready for our first question?
Let's do it.
So this and the following ones come kind of broadly under the heading of psychoanalysis and like different therapeutic modalities, clinical topics, broadly speaking. And this first one is from Imogen. And I loved this question. So Imogen writes, and just to be clear, I have not edited these, but I have occasionally cut some of them, mostly because you all wrote so much nice stuff. And I felt incredibly uncomfortable reading all of those compliments out over the air. But thank you. We appreciate you. Okay. Question from Imogen. I've been wondering about the speed and time in relation to analysis. I'm a therapist, and many of my colleagues emphasize the importance of speed in their treatment, especially as it might be enhanced by ketamine, MDMA, EMDR, brain spotting, etc. My knee-jerk reaction is something about the merits of taking the long way, but I can't tell if I'm simply being reactive. Do Freud, Klein, Winnicott, Lacan, etc. have anything to say about the merits or demerits of long ways / shortcuts?
How about let's put a pin in the part of the question that involves the drugs, because a lot of y'all want to know about drugs. A lot of you really want.
You all want drugs and Lacan. Those are my main takeaways.
And Marx. Yeah.
Let's put a pin in that. And while also flagging, I think, the valid dimension of the skepticism, or like the knee-jerk stuff there, because we'll deal with drugs more generally presently. And let's just thematize and reflect on this idea of like the benefits and the drawbacks and the compromises and trade-offs of like thinking about psychotherapy in fast and slow terms, right? It's definitely the case that the idea of psychoanalysis as mandating like depth psychotherapy, right? Not just like you're going to talk about things for 50 minutes a day for several days a week or for weeks at a time or for years of your life, but also you're going to go real deep about like your childhood and the dreams you just had, and like really like dig deep into the psyche, if you want to use that type of metaphor. That's a feature of a lot of psychoanalytic traditions and is at the center of a lot of debates about what makes something, quote unquote, properly psychoanalysis, which isn't just an abstract consideration, but also has to do with like, is your healthcare going to pay for it as opposed to other types of psychotherapy? Are you going to get trained or certified in it? You know, if you're, and some of the language that we've talked about, the idea of like psychodynamic treatments, which is a orientation that has a sensitivity to questions of the unconscious and to, you know, psychic life as involving sort of an ongoing metabolism and interplay of different forces, is about litigating that, right? Or at least trying to find ways around that. So lots of treatments can be psychodynamic in orientation, but not necessarily be like classical psychoanalysis. Oh yeah, and we should just say, like, in the contemporary world, very few people can afford or have the time to do depth psychoanalysis in the classical psychoanalytic style, where it's like you're doing it for 4 or 5 days a week. And yeah, hell, I mean, Freud even would say you can't make other life decisions during this period.
Yeah. And as I have said at least once on this podcast, it is very hard to like both make time for going to psychoanalysis several times a week and going to the gym. You pretty much got to pick. Like,
yeah. And that's, I think, the other half of it. Or
can I just say? Can I just say? This is on the mode of speed. I don't usually talk about my own experiences with therapy, but when I went to a CBT practitioner in my 20s. And I was studying philosophy and religious studies and whatnot. And I was in my 20s. Like I'm sorry, I had nothing to do, but like there are very few times when like in your life where you really are like, I mean, I wasn't getting paid well, but I was getting paid to read and write. And at some point I just said like, no, you don't understand. Like I need about 3 hours a day to just like stare at the wall. And this therapist looked at me and she was like, you think you could cut that down to about half an hour? And I was like, you're fired.
Yeah, can we cut this down to 15 minutes?
I was like, absolutely not. We're talking about my flourishing as a human being here. And I need my fucking wall staring time. So, you know, I think Patrick is right to zero in very much on, you know, not only the external factors that have pushed us towards these speedier modalities, but also the way in which, like, if you're being reactive for a good reason. And I guess what I want to say, without actually answering the question specifically about like whether Freud, Klein, Winnicott, Lacan, et cetera, have something specific to say about this, I would speak to the whole tradition rather and say, and maybe this also doubles as, you know, yet another response to the question of why is psychoanalysis like in again, you know, why Freud now again, is that psychoanalysis, I think, is a radically anti-modern practice. And I almost, in some ways, and, you know, we can also talk about like the short session, like there's tons of very specific ways in which we can talk about how to squeeze the unconscious like a tube of fucking toothpaste and be like, wait, let me just can I get a little more out there? Can it go a little bit faster?
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the practice is one, at least conceptually, and I think also in terms of its structure, in terms of the clinical framework, that does not prioritize speediness. I mean, psychoanalysis is like the anti-Chat GPT, right? Like, you're not going to get the answers that you want, and you're not going to get them on the timeline that you asked for. But maybe eventually you're going to get what you need.
I mean, that's part of the point, isn't it? Isn't the time kind of part of the point? Not to say that, I don't know, not to say that the faster stuff isn't potentially useful.
Right.
That was like one of my first observations when I started reading Freud was like, wow, this is really useful. I can feel it changing the way I see the world. This is like, it's applicable almost immediately, but it takes so much time to learn it. And the process is so time consuming that, say, were the goal to heal the world, there's not enough time in the universe to heal people before they die, you know? Like it becomes almost a generational problem.
There's also the issue, and I think this is something that we would be remiss if we didn't comment on, is that suffering is painful and that all of these modalities are an attempt to relieve suffering. And it is all well and good for us to sit and be like, okay, we're going to take our time with this psychoanalytic text because like we're not trying to actually heal anybody through that.
Yep.
But there are, if you are in acute psychic pain, the desire to alleviate that distress sooner rather than later is something that I think is actually really important to talk about.
And I think those are all great points. And I just want to underscore a couple of them real quick. The first one being that I think, Abby, you're absolutely right. A lot of the question of psychotherapy in general, and I think any good psychoanalyst is going to be interested in some kind of psychotherapy, right? And some type of practice of healing and care. And it's going to prioritize that over their method, right? It has to reflect some actual engagement with where a person is at and what they want to do, and also what, they can be capable of doing at any given moment. And practically speaking, that might be, you can't pay for, $500 an hour psychoanalytic treatment in, New York City or Chicago with a classical Freudian style or Lacanian style analyst. But also it's worth thinking about that in terms of what's the character of the problem, right? Is the problem one of an acute thing you're going through? Or is the problem a recurrent pattern that you find yourself stuck in on another level? And maybe we could also talk about that in terms of like, are we trying to deal with symptom relief? I don't know, you're having panic attacks because you're executing your parents' estate or will, right? Or you're struggling to find a job in a new town. Or are you invested in, or do you need something that may require more stability, but also that's going to go to the level of like personality change, right? If you find yourself having the same relationship over and over again, if you find yourself getting fired for the same reasons over and over again, and none of these are like moral judgments. They're just like, is this something that is best dealt with for now in terms of like triage and dealing with symptoms? Or is it about altering sort of the deeper structures that may be forcing us to relive certain things that then manifest symptomatically? And at that point, it's worth saying that part of what the dynamic in the psychodynamic perspective gets at is precisely what Dan just pointed to, namely this idea that you don't just have like an unconscious, i.e. like this part of you that is occasionally active, like when you sleep or when you're high or something, but rather it's a dynamic unconscious. It's always there. It's always kind of processing things. And part of the pain of life, the way in which like a lost manifests, like you think you've moved on from a breakup and then you hear a song when you're out clubbing or something and you're a wreck, right? Or you suddenly have intrusive images or thoughts about something that happened to you a long time ago that's getting in the way, right? That you thought you had moved on from. It's precisely that idea of how your psyche, your unconscious aspects, like again, it's always there, has been continually sort of working on something and maybe kind of stuck.
Yeah.
The consequences of that might be dealt with in a short term. And maybe even if you deal with the consequences, then suddenly you don't have to worry about that deeper stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked with people like Agi Sakatopoulou and Anne Pellegrini about how some analysts can sometimes themselves be tricked into the idea of thinking that focusing on the depth stuff, right? Like the way people were abused as a child may actually not be that important. Maybe they've already integrated that and moved on. Maybe the person who's really hung up on that is the analyst in those encounters, and they want to actually make it worse by going deeper. But it's also worth saying that sometimes there are things that can benefit from more conscious sort of processing with another person on an open-ended timeline, precisely because your unconscious self, your unconscious, is still processing those things too. And I think an ability to distinguish between those operationally, but also conceptualize how they relate to one another sort of concretely and theoretically, is really important.
Patrick, I know you have like a couple of actual recommendations too, but let me just like tag in on one more aspect of this question, which is the question of reactivity. And I actually think that's important. And it indexes something which I think has something to do with the way in which some, not all, but some therapeutic modalities that are aimed at speed and are also aimed at speedy targeted symptom relief, they evacuate so much of the possibility of what the psychodynamic mode makes possible. And that's the way in which some of us, I know I'm not alone in this, almost take personal offense at them. Because there is this sense of like, well, I am not simply a series of symptoms, or I am a more complex being. And so there's this way in which, and I'm not saying that you should not like go and do any and all of these sorts of treatments if they help. Do any and all of them. But I think, and I have experienced this firsthand, there can be this sort of, it's almost like a narcissistic wound that opens up at the idea that like the psyche is a thing that ought to be treated in a way that can seem almost like kind of like demeaning to its complexity.
Your computer needs a software update.
Yeah.
It's the promise of a speedy treatment begs the question of speed to what?
Yeah.
And that what is usually work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you do want to look in some places for different texts that variously like answer this question, like slow or fast, but also thematize some of the topics that we've already kind of touched on in terms of how analysis relates to real world suffering and how does it relate to symptom relief versus personality change, et cetera. I think one thing people oftentimes think of, and Abby's already mentioned it, is Lacan's practice of what's called the short session, which is justified by him in a typical Lacanian pun by this idea of precipitating change. But the precipitate, is a term that can mean not just like rain, but also like a chemical suspension that, comes when you shake something. And I'm not a chemistry person, but you know what I mean? Like
Am I right in remembering that Lacan observed that the most important part of a session was the last 10 minutes when the patient felt the need to get the real thing out? And he was like, why not just make the session 10 minutes?
Exactly. Yeah. And you could see how that could translate into a clinical method where you're like, this could end at any moment.
Wait, it's random. It's not actually a 10-minute session.
Right. Yeah. Just as an example.
But the possibility of the termination of a session, something other than that sacrosanct 50 minutes, is mobilized as a therapeutic intervention via this logic of what Lacan calls the precipitate, which is
I always think of it as like goosing the unconscious.
Yeah, I'd have even more panic attacks if I were to do it. It's just terrible. I don't think that works for certain types. In any event, though, I will say that a person who explains a lot of those dimensions of Lacanian thought, whose work I really want to recommend, is a person who actually taught Lacan with, which is Corinne Rohr-Malone, who is a psychoanalyst in the Lacanian tradition, but who has a bunch of really good texts for, actually, one of them is written for practicing psychologists and social workers and stuff. So like that explains some of these things, and it goes through the text, and you'll find a bibliographic sort of go-tos for that. Another text that might be interesting for people is a little book by Owen Rennick, who I believe is an Australian psychoanalyst, called Practical Psychoanalysis for Patients and Therapists.
I love that book.
Yeah, it's a fun one, right?
Yeah. I mean, I remember, Patrick, you handed this to me like 5 years ago, and I just like sat down and read it in an afternoon, and I was like, oh, that's yeah.
Yeah, it's a short, it's like 150 pages maybe, and some of it is kind of, we didn't really have the word back when this was like a splash, which is now 20 years ago, but some of it's a bit of a troll, where he's like, I changed someone's life in 5 minutes at the cocktail party. I'm being a little bit exaggerating, but some of it is like that. He's like, is this psychoanalysis, right? And he kind of, that question, the emphasis towards the practical is about like, is this about you as an analyst satisfying your pro forma definitions of what a psychoanalyst should be, or is it actually about producing certain types of change? So that's a book to check out. It's kind of a fun one. And then the third thing, because we have these Freudian commitments, I would feel remiss not referring to, and hell, I actually just taught it for my late Freud course for the
Oh,
Brooklyn
is this
Institute.
analysis terminable and interminable?
Analysis terminable and interminable.
Yeah.
Which
Just
is
honestly, like, just pause this podcast and go read analysis terminable
Yeah.
and interminable.
and then read it again. Yeah, and then read it again. Like the gimmick in my late Freud
And then
course
pause
is
it
we
again.
read it every week.
And then
yeah.
read it again. And then, yeah.
It's
You'll never make it to the end and you'll know just what it's like to be us.
And the text is remarkable, I mean, for a lot of reasons, because it deals with all those dimensions, not just the three baskets, but the things we're talking about right now, being like, am I trying to fix a person's like suffering in the world? How much of this is about a person individually? How much of this is about the society that they live in? What do we make of the fact that people still seem to suffer even after they had a psychoanalysis? What's even the point of all this? Freud never really answers these questions, but you get a sense of him.
That's why you have to keep reading it.
Yeah, but you get a sense of him struggling with not just those questions, but his own career and legacy as a psychoanalyst. And this is where we get that very interesting injunction, which Janet Malcolm takes up as the name of her book, of psychoanalysis as an impossible profession. And an impossible profession alongside, famously, teaching and governance. And just to be...
So real.
Yeah, just to be like earnest about this, the takeaway there is just because it's impossible doesn't mean it isn't necessary.
All right, next question. Kathy writes, I am in my training to become a psychoanalyst. I'd like to read more / listen to more of the good stuff that is psychoanalytical. Can you recommend some blogs or websites, either written by psychoanalysts or written psychoanalytically? Hoping to read some good writing about psychoanalytical thinking of modern life.
This one I think we can deal with fairly quickly, while also indicating that there's a lot of new stuff out there and there's always more stuff happening, particularly now. I would just, off the top of my head, plug, well, Parapraxis, of course.
Yeah, of course.
And particularly the Ask a Psychoanalyst questions that they've been doing, which are really, really fun because you get a sense of the different clinical schools and it's just fun. The American Psychoanalytic Association, APSA, has a series that they call Psychoanalysis Unplugged.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool, and different guest authors will blog on it. And there are a bunch of other psychoanalytic associations that have different sort of blog verticals and will occasionally feature, occasionally send psychoanalysts to write for like Psychology Today, et cetera. And I think you can find a pretty good roundup of that at a link we'll include in the show notes today. Let's pivot to podcasts. I have a couple of thoughts, but how about you, Abby?
I mean, in terms of listening, the one psychoanalytic podcast that I regularly tune into is New Books in Psychoanalysis. And I don't think it's just because I'm a big nerd, but I think it is, if you want to have a sense of some of the material that is really interesting and generative and new, you should listen to that. You should be listening to that.
Yeah, and the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, has a podcast series, I believe it's called Off the Couch, and APSA has recently been doing a new one too. And so going to the websites, you'll find them. Yeah. No, I've listened to a couple of them. So but these are things to consider.
I could shout out, I use nosubject.com all the time.
Oh, yeah.
All the time. That's a really good resource. It's more or less just like a Wikipedia kind of a website. So if you're looking for a certain term explained or something like that, and you don't have your psychoanalytic terms, what was that book called? The terms.
Oh yeah, the vocabulary of psychoanalysis.
Yes,
the language of psychoanalysis.
I have that on my desk. I love it.
Oh, the Laplanche and Pontellier.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a kind of a different question, but
no, yeah, I'm
it's
just saying
it's a really it's. I mean, the more times that we can tell people to buy that book,
yeah.
But also, No Subject is good.
No Subject is
Danny
great
Nobis
for a quick
project.
hit.
Yeah, and I think Todd McGowan's Why Theory has some overlap here, but it's not quite as clinically oriented. But yeah,
and also if you or a kind person that you know has access to PepWeb, psychoanalytic electronic publishing.
Yeah, drink from the source for sure.
That is going to give you, I mean, everything that you want. I mean, not everything you want, but in terms of in terms of classic texts, like everything is there. So like, honestly, if you don't have access to it, like just make a friend who works in an R1 just so that they can give you their PepWeb access.
Use them.
I'm not saying that.
I also want to shout out on YouTube, ContraPoints. Not a psychoanalyst. I'm not sure how much training she has in psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis is like weaved all throughout her stuff.
Yeah.
So just want to shout that out. Also pretty useful.
And I think that will give us a nice pivot or at least something we can call back to later, in the sense that if we do think about psychoanalysis, at least as we're conceiving it on this podcast, as more of an orientation than a set of doctrines, there is a lot of, well, psychoanalysis never went away. And it's informed a lot of what I think is just people being smart in general when it comes to consuming and producing cultural text. But also there are lots of different people who are working with psychoanalytic concepts that, pun, I guess, intended, do work in their own right at explaining complicated phenomena.
Yeah. All right, next question. Danny writes, I'm really curious to learn more about queerness in psychoanalysis and if you have insight on how to address it. I just finished a book called Blackouts by Justin Torres, and it had so many psychoanalytic name drops and themes to various people. And I feel like it would be really cool to talk to the author of that book or just discuss the book in general. Full disclosure, I have downloaded that book, but I have not read it yet, although it comes really highly recommended. So we hear you and we will read it and report back. But also, how about, Patrick, I take some of the classic stuff and you take a little bit of the more modern stuff on this one? Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
At the risk of beating a dead horse, you got to go back to Freud on this because, okay, Freud did not invent queerness. Don't hear me as saying that. But if you want to read in the psychoanalytic tradition about gender and sexuality in ways that are not rigidly heteronormative, although Freud certainly gives you a lot of grist for that heteronormative mill, I think you have to start with the 1905 3 essays on the theory of sexuality to get into the idea of polymorphous perversity, to get into the idea that heterosexuality is an achievement, right? It's not something that we are just programmed to do. I always think about this text that I teach in a gender studies class, Adrienne Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, where like one of the motivating questions is like, well, wait, if the first loved object for pretty much all of us is the mother, why would anyone ever love a man? Right? It's so much work to switch that. I mean, she doesn't put it in those terms. But I do think that like the concept of polymorphous perversity, and you could also look at some of Freud's early case studies and letters where he, is really, really clear that he is not in the business of what we will come to know as conversion therapy, because he has this really capacious sense of human sexuality. So I think you got to go to the well there before you turn to other texts.
Let's just interject, or if you don't mind, I want to affirm what Abby is saying, and also just to gloss this term, right?
Oh, please.
This is what exactly does it mean to talk about polymorphous perversity? Recall this thing we're going to keep repeating, that in the psychoanalytic, broadly speaking, perspective, the psyche is dynamic. Things are being shaped in an ongoing way, right? Structures are not given so much as they are made over time, and they have to be continually responsive to internal developments in your body, but also external developments in the world. And to put it in the terms that sort of Abby just gave us, right? The thing that is presented as natural and given, namely heterosexual orientation in so many cultures, has to come from somewhere. By which I mean, it's not kids don't self-identify as straight out of the womb, right? They don't say anything, but literally they don't know those terms. And in fact, you have all these people is it a boy? Is it a girl? There all these questions. In other words, you have the child moving from a position where their body is literally built differently. What are their pleasures? Who knows? There's what a lot of the Kleinian project is trying to figure out what's it like to be a baby, right? What to have these different germ layers and pleasures.
Sorry, that always makes me think, what is it like to be a bat?
I mean, honestly, the questions are almost equally challenging in some ways, right? Or what's it like to be a baby bat? Adorable is the answer. But
yeah, I want one.
Yeah, they're so cute.
A bat, not a baby.
but the idea here then
only one can give you rabies.
And this is sort of also what's at stake in the etymological sense of orientation, right? Orientation is what are you turned towards?
Yeah,
right?
We're all actually, you can't see us, but we've all been making that sort of gesture of the turning toward, turning away from. Yeah.
And So polymorphous perversity is understood as like the equipotential capacity or like the basic plasticity that we all start out with vis-a-vis who are, I would say ultimate, but this actually underscores the fact that it's never really that ultimate, our subsequent object choices for erotic attachment are going to be.
Yes.
So in a certain sense, you could say, and this is playing fast and loose, that like the subject is sort of always already queer, or that whatever we talk about in queerness as adults is something that we have to think about in terms of these ongoing social processes that intervene heavily in childhood and puberty, et cetera, but then are maintained on an ongoing level. And part of Freud's project, and there's a fabulous section of Civilization's Discontents I know we've already talked about on the podcast, where Freud basically describes how not everybody, and even the people who are at like the center of that charm circle, can get with the paradigm. And there's a lot of friction between our orientations and social institutions, even for people who are, again, supposedly at the center of it. For a good collected volume that sort of surveys that and that is fairly new, and I've only just started, I did want to recommend The Queerness of Psychoanalysis from Freud and Lacan to Laplanche and Beyond, which is edited by Vanessa Sinclair, Elizabeth Punzi, and Miriam Sauer. Again, sexual identity, sexual orientation, these things are not given. They are dynamically made.
All right, next question. Gregory writes, as of recently, you guys have really tackled some huge blind spots of Freud's with the focus on Winnicott, Klein, and the relationship with the mother and child. It's been so amazing, by the way, but I can't help but keep questioning this elephant in the room, which is the autistic child/mother. I feel looking at the mind through the autistic lens would be so enlightening because I think it will touch so many subjects all at once, like gender or language. The blame they get along with the mother, our political discourse on vaccines. It's all there, and I think it will be so amazing if you guys covered this with all the delicacies and grace that I believe you guys are more than capable of giving. This subject would be so beneficial to me and hopefully everyone else. Even doing a wild analysis by looking at Severance or Blade Runner as dealing with autism. P.S. Leon Brenner has a book on Lacan and the autism subject. Perhaps that might be a good way at approaching this topic.
We really appreciate that suggestion and also just are really touched by the kind words there. It's absolutely something that has been on our radar to do and that I've been trying to educate myself more about by reading in that area. It's worth saying that I'm once again saddened by the passing of Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes, just a great book about the history of autism and the various nosologies related to that. He was just a lovely human being, and I corresponded with him briefly, and we meant to link up, but didn't have the chance. It's worth saying that the history of psychoanalysis vis-a-vis children and parents who have been labeled autistic or who would self-identify now as autistic, right, that history is not great.
It has not always been kind, no.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of a foundational text or a very important text that comes out of the Tavistock Clinic in the 70s is Ann Alvarez's Live Company, Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy with Autistic, Borderline, Deprived, and Abused Children. And you can kind of tell from that title.
From the title a little bit about some of the assumptions baked into what they're thinking about in terms of autism there, yeah.
And you could also, I think, feel or suspect how this problem of like, how do you deal with the child who is going to be diagnosed as autistic or who you are diagnosing as autistic ramifies in particularly vicious and perhaps anxiogenic way for clinicians who are already struggling to talk about like, what's the internal life of the infant, right? Or how do I, classify children in terms of their incipient desires and orientations towards the world, right? This is something that in the past 15 to 20 years, and really in the past 10, there's been better and better stuff written about. I'm thinking Mary Target has done some stuff. The Brenner has already come up.
Yeah, I'd like to read that. I haven't read it.
It's also been striking, given some exposure I had to some of the French kind of sort of Lacanian, crypto-Lacanian schools of thought on this, that they oftentimes do fall precisely into what Gregory identifies as like mother blaming.
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of like...
A lot of that to go around.
There's a lot of like leaning on these kind of explanatory models where it's like, well, actually the autistic child suffers from like early gaze avoidance from a mother who is borderline or depressed, et cetera. And it's like, that just seems inadequate to me in addition to the red flags that it obviously raises. Suffice it to say, we're building a bibliography on this. We'll have some people who are specifically versed in this on the show in the coming year, I hope.
Maybe this is also a good moment for me to say that we make no promises, but we also do and have gotten great recommendations for guests and books to discuss from you all the time. So, send those in by all means. Okay, next question. And this is more just about wishes, which is great because this is a podcast that cares about wish fulfillment.
Tell us your desires. We're here for it.
We can't promise to fulfill them, but we will listen
We'll
to
listen.
them. Okay, Verity writes, as for wishes, would love a wild analysis on Saltburn.
Me too.
Okay.
Also thought the Hate and the Countertransference close reading was great and would love more Winnicott, Bion, and Klein. Final wish would be something on Laplanche's theory on seduction. Does this mean I have to watch Saltburn?
I think you should, just because it's a great little film. It's awesome. Bathtub scene alone.
That's kind of why I don't necessarily want to see.
There's a lot of great like kinky identification going around. And I like the I don't want to say too much about it. We'll have to watch it. I agree with this. I really liked Saltburn.
All right. Saltburn wild analysis. Twist my arm.
And I think some stuff from Laplanche would be really good too. I remember being fascinated by the stuff Avi was talking about, and Anne also was talking about like the overwhelm. And I think that's
that's
great
a
stuff.
goal.
Yeah.
It might be a 2026 goal.
Yeah.
But yeah.
We're listening.
We're listening.
Yeah.
We're listening. We're interested. Laplanche is envisioned for the future. And if you know a lot about Laplanche, tell us so you can come talk to us. Okay, next question. This is a long one. And also, like I said, I mostly edited out all of the praise, but I just loved this whole message. So I'm leaving it intact. So this is from Corey. My partner and I have been listening to you for over a year now, maybe even over 2. I've lost count. Anyway, I really enjoy all of your episodes. Your podcast has inspired me to read a shit ton of Freud.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. As well as some additional Lacan, Winnicott, Klein, and just other texts that I may not have gotten around to otherwise. I'm 36 now and have been reading philosophy ever since I was an angsty farm boy reading Nietzsche at 17. Relatable. Over the past 5 or 6 years, I made my way to Lacan through Zizek, but then realized that my fundamental Freud texts were lacking. So you've been a great help in filling in my blind spots and offering a good intellectual foundation to a lot of these concepts and theories. Abby, you say you love recommending books? Well, I love your recommendations. Keep them coming. My partner is finishing her master's to get her LICSW, and I think partly due to our mutual interest in psychoanalysis, is hoping to do her fall practicum at a psychoanalytic institute here in Minnesota. And I think that's really cool.
Yay.
To have a relationship where we can nerd out about theory, but where one of us also gets to use this in their daily practice. She currently works with people suffering from severe and persistent mental illness. SPMI for short. Think psychoses rather than neuroses. Is really cool. And in an oblique way, I find myself using these concepts in my profession as an actor, stage and screen. All that to say, you've become, perhaps through some transference, if that can happen through a podcast, an important part of my life. Thanks. Some requests, more episodes on Lacan, an interview with Todd McGowan, episodes on psychoanalysis and psychedelics.
There's those drugs again.
I loved this. Hello to you and your partner. You sound fabulous. Thank you for listening and for reading a quote shit ton of Freud. That makes my fucking week.
Yay.
More Lacan is coming up. I mean, you all are asking for it so hard. You're going to get it good and hard. And we are working on psychoanalysis and psychedelics. We're actually going to do a little bit of a series on psychedelic therapy. Our first episode, I'm so fucking psyched about this, is with a writer, one of our OU favorite writers, Sarah Miller, who has a piece coming out in the next N+1 on ayahuasca, and she's going to come talk to us about that really soon. But we are also planning to talk to some clinicians about that. So we want to be thinking very much about the phenomenological experience of psychedelics and psychedelic therapies, but also talk to folks who are like working on clinical trials and can get into that side of it.
Yeah, and for my part, I'm doing some background reading on this phenomena that sort of emerges in the 1930s and comes and goes over the course of psychoanalytic and psychodynamic history, which is the idea of what's called narcoanalysis. There's some other terms for it too, but basically it's this
That's the sexiest one.
Yeah, it's this idea that, like, well, if you give someone barbiturates, are they disinhibited in a way that might be analogous to hypnosis, but also still allow them to free associate in a different way, etc. As you can probably expect, this has
some ethical issues.
Well, I mean, it's a colorful history, right? One way or another. And it also kind of throws in sharper relief some of the features that we've already gotten into in the standard edition, for example, namely the fact that a lot of these clinicians are, giving patients morphine or what is it? Some sort of chlorate, right? They're getting dosed with some pretty heavy substances, but that's understood as being separate from the work of, talk therapy or the interpretation of things. And it's at that point that I think we could, as we approach the question of psychedelics and other drugs too, to think about how that implicates, well, let's go back to our three baskets again, right? How much, and our problem that we first talked about in the first question, right? How much of what drugs do sort of efficaciously, biologically, in terms of like the hard science of, what they do or don't do in your brain or how they work in, in your liver or whatnot.
Can you tell we're humanists?
Yeah. Is separable from what drugs mean.
Yes.
I.e., is this drug something that's being prescribed and given to you by a doctor? Is that a quote unquote understood as maintenance? Is that troped as dependence or addiction? Or is that, related to fantasies that we have about drugs that once were illicit or that are understood as not being about pleasure, but that then become licit, but get invested with kind of hopes, sometimes Silicon Valley style, sometimes like shamanistic exoticizing style.
Sometimes both.
Yeah, or sometimes a little bit of both.
There's a convergence there.
And how does that relate to ideas or anxieties that we might have vis-a-vis one, like quick fixes, right? Things that are about symptom relief.
Oh, I actually thought you were talking about Ben Fong's book, Quick Fixes.
That's exactly what I was going to get to.
Oh.
Yeah, people should go back and check out that episode.
I was thinking that too. And I was thinking particularly because of one of the things that really underrates that entire book, which I co-sign everybody going and reading, is the insistence on not analyzing legal and illegal drugs separately, but on reading those together. I think it's like really, really generative and will make you think very, very differently about like what drugs are and how they mean and how they work. And
the question that he asks, and this is the second half of what I was building towards, is do we understand drugs as being about symptom relief or personality change? Or in other terms, what are drugs a symptom of in their own right, and what can they do or not do, both like in the real, i.e. like you suddenly feel a little bit happier, right? Or you're not retching with a panic attack, versus what they sort of mean and the fantasies we imbue them with that then they actually have very real material effects. So this is something we're definitely going to be queuing into, and we'll get a little more granular too about stuff like, I don't know, like state-specific memory. And I'll just own this one just up front. I've definitely, just speaking for myself, I'm not putting your view in this basket, because where I've been like, I've had profound psychological insights at certain points in my life. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is what's going on with me, right? Or this is what's going on with other people. And then
the drugs wear off.
Or it's the next day and I promptly forget. Right?
Oh, you mean actual profound insights, like real? I thought you were just like, I come down and I'm like, oh, I'm not actually all one with the universe.
Or even more grimly, I'm like, wow, we're all made of stars, and so is fucking Elon Musk and the trash. You know, like, this is not good. But like really, like you could see how this might affect
Jesus,
something
Patrick.
like our notion of like a dynamic unconscious, right? Like associations, word choices, stories that you remember, or things from your past that like come back into your memory. Maybe you really will get some stuff out of like being on ketamine for a while and disassociating, but is the memory or the resolutions or whatever it is you form in different altered states necessarily going to translate into states outside of it? And at which point I would like, if anyone remembers, there was a viral tweet some years ago. It had the form of someone saying, I love smoking pot because then I can forget about the things that bother me and have anxiety attacks about things that don't, only to later sober up and have anxiety attacks about the things that were bothering me. And
So real.
Yeah.
listener, I thought this was brilliant at the time. I bookmarked it. I can't find it and don't remember who said it. So if someone wants to dig that out of the archive, please do.
There was also a line smuggled in this question that I really loved. And I think we're going to have to touch on this in episode 2, because I think it fits in nicely with some stuff we're going to do. Episode 2 of this little mini
Episode
series.
101.
Yeah, episode 101 for the 100th. And that's this little story, this little vignette that we get about finding Lacan through Zizek, and then realizing that you have to backpedal to Freud to better understand this stuff. And I just want to say I relate to that. And I do, maybe in the next episode, I want to pester you guys about what is it that's so seductive about Lacan that leads people to Freud, as opposed to people stumbling on Freud to begin with. Yeah. What is it about this, that's slipping? You can kind of say something similar about Marx in that way too. But there are these seductive thinkers, and then there's this foundational one, and people find the seductive ones, seductive.
The Lacan to Zizek pipeline?
Yeah.
That leads us beautifully, Dan, to our next question from James. One request, more Lacan, please. I continue to be curious about Lacanianism, which I've found well nigh impossible to tackle on my own. I'm particularly interested in the graph of desire, the fundamental fantasy, and what it might mean to traverse the fantasy. These are all very intriguing and mysterious ideas, and I would love to hear your take on them.
Me too.
I'll just take this one on the chin.
As our resident Lacanian. You're the closest thing we have to a Lacanian.
I mean, I spent a decade of my life more learning Lacanian theory and translating Lacan at cause Freudian in Paris, all this type of stuff.
I know, it's amazing that you're as well adjusted as you are.
Well, I mean,
I didn't say it was that well adjusted.
Thank you. This is a conversation that I think we could have more in depth and very productively by returning to this question of the subject supposed to know.
Yeah.
And here I think about a book by Mikhail Borsch-Jakobson called The Absolute Master, which is about Lacan. But part of the reason why Lacan is so hard, apart from the fact that he is untranslatable in many ways, or at least he's as translatable as a poem is translatable, you're
going to lose something.
Yeah, rhymes don't work across different languages, as simple as that. Is that there isn't just one Lacan, there are many Lacans. He revises himself across the course of his theory. And I think Lacan is, much in the same way, actually, I think we've approached Freud, is perhaps more productively approached thinking about him in terms of what are his recurrent problems, or what are the problems that he seems to be circling around in different ways? How does he produce new vocabularies to consciously sort of shake up what have previously been formal or overly formalized theorizations or structures? What is gained by his moving to metaphors? Freud will move to metaphors in biology. Why does Lacan move to metaphors in language? What's up with these graphs, for example? What's the role of metaphor in this thought? And how does the process of reading Lacan try and produce an effect, or listening to Lacan produce an effect in the reader? And one way I think, and this is not a particularly original thought, many people have said this, one thing that Lacan does to his audiences, or tried to do to his audiences, is try to put them in relation to his speech in a position that's similar to how we might relate to this weirdness that is the unconscious and how it relates to language. That said, for people who want to kind of get their toes or brains wet,
their feet wet.
Their feet wet, sure.
I know what you were thinking.
Yeah, I was thinking about getting wet as in dipping a cigarette in PCP, and that's another
Jesus Christ.
If you want to read Lacan in the primary, Lacan's own Lacan, I would begin by reading the seminars. The essays in the Ikri are incredibly hard. I would start with the first two seminars, because they're about Freud, and Lacan is more circumspect. But
can I make a plug real quick?
Yeah.
I have had similar experiences with Lacan. I mean, sort of like the Zizek to Lacan to Freud pipeline. I made my way to Lacan from Kristeva and Irigaray, and then I went to Lacan and then back to Freud. And the book that really kind of cracked things open for me was Bruce Fink's Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis. There's something about I just think it's a really good book, first of all, but there's something about the way that it is really interested in things like Lacanian categories of diagnosis, and that it's always still thinking about patients. make some of this stuff that seems like so abstruse as to like become actual math. It makes it grounded in, I don't want to say in the real, but in some dimension of reality. So I'm deeply committed to reading primary sources. That is like how I work as a teacher. Lacan is one of the very few people that I'm like, go back and read some secondary literature first, because you need to have a handle on some of it. You need commentary. And that's my plug for like a place to start to make some of this stuff more accessible, and to kind of like get you to that place where it feels really challenging, but like in that way where it's like it's breaking my brain in a good way rather than it's breaking my brain in a demoralizing way.
And I'll second that by saying first that I want to underscore Corinne Rohr Malone's books on Lacan for practitioners, which again are very grounded in the clinical. Among other things, she has a very, I think, astute account of like drug use in these terms. She talks about drugs as being the imaginary in the real, which is a very interesting way to think about it.
Yeah. Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's very smart. The other two texts that I think about, and if the Fink and Corinne stuff are more for people who are interested in like the clinical dimensions up front, for whom that's more present.
Yeah. There's other Fink stuff that's very useful. In general, Bruce Fink, I think, is very, very helpful as a interpreter of Lacan, especially as a place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. But for people who are not necessarily, for whom the clinical itself may be more distal, and who may not even, or who want to come at Lacan in a sort of different way, namely thinking about like what are the patterns or gestures or the recurrent preoccupations, another way to get into this that is much more didactic and tighter and less, I think, contradictory, which is, I think, really important for Lacan because he's systematically unsystematic. Like that's the way he works, right? There's a systematicity to the way in which he undoes and spins out these new systems. Two books, Malcolm Bowie's book, Lacan.
Yeah, we've
Loved
recommended
that
that
book.
a lot of times, and we're going to do it again.
The audiobook is great too for
Really?
folks that like to listen.
I didn't know there was an audiobook.
Mhm. Yeah.
Oh, that's great news. So yeah, that's a classic one. And then the second one is, it's a book by Shoshana Fellman called Jacques Lacan and the Adventure of Insight, which is likewise incredibly sort of pedagogical and also downright beautiful in some moments about through taking a Lacanian reading of themes in various texts that Lacan takes up, for example, like Poe's Purloined Letter or the story of Oedipus, but by then turning to those texts themselves, really explicating these basic but truly profound dimensions of Lacan's thought vis-a-vis like how does structure relate to focus, right? That's the Purloined Letter. It's out in the open, but we don't see it. Or, and here I think she's particularly elegant in what she does, how does the story of Oedipus, but not just Oedipus Rex, but Oedipus a colonist, like the second later story about Oedipus, how does that give us a template for thinking about not just like the Oedipus complex, chez Freud, or, you know, in the popular sense of it, but structuralized in the way that I think Lacan structuralizes Freud in a very useful way, as like a motif or template for the ways in which we relate to worlds that we enter, identities that we're forced to assume, and stories that we think we have to live through. And the fulfillment of that in like the tragic mode, right? That's Oedipus is a tragic hero. He's the original one in some tellings of it. And the recognition of that story, or that recognition of that kind of like fatal destiny, and then a shift in relating to it that allows for new possibilities, gets specifically at one of the things that James asked about, namely this idea of traversing the fantasy, which is some sort of relationship between where you're coming from, where you felt you had to go, and a new relationship to those terms that's not really a flight into something else or a new fantasy, but a kind of cutting across it.
One more plug for, it's an oldie but a goodie, is Elizabeth Gross's feminist introduction to Lacan. I mean, I think you should probably be interested in feminism, but even if you aren't, it's still a really good introduction to this, you know, really formidable body of work. All right. I'm going to read these next two questions together because they're both about Marx and Freud. So first, Harvey writes, as a longtime Marxist who has recently, with your help, cultivated an interest in the ways that a psychoanalytic framework enriches my understanding of the current conjuncture, can you recommend 3 or 4 books that fruitfully investigate and or interrogate the ordinary unhappy synthesis of these traditions? Okay, only like the hardest question. Well, and not the question of book recommendations. We can do book recommendations. The synthesis of Marx and Freud is the hardest question.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is also, this was one of the first ones that we got. And everyone showed up to be like, yes, please. Yes, please. Yes, please. So in addition to asking for Lacan drugs, you all had a lot of questions about Marx. All right. Jeremy writes, +1 to prior comments and questions around Marxism and psychoanalysis, not only for efforts and example of synthesis, but also their interrelations and disjunctions. When is one framework more useful than others? How does each reveal the other's lacunae, vulnerabilities, weaknesses? I'm thinking of psychoanalysis's tendency towards universalizing theories and inability to think space, place. And Jeremy also says, +1 towards more clinically and theoretically oriented psychoanalytic writers like Sakatopoulou. Yeah, agreed also. Before we get into some of like the broader issues that second question poses, let me throw out a couple of book recommendations. A People's History of Psychoanalysis by Daniel Jose Gaztambide. A People's History of Psychoanalysis by Florent Gabaron Garcia.
Yes, 2 books, same title.
2 books, same title, different authors. Eli Zaretsky's Secrets of the Soul. That's a long read, and it's not, I mean, none of these are just about this question, but it comes up and they address it in really interesting ways. And finally, a book that has come up a number of times since we started the show. I know that we talked about it in the Fanon as Clinician episode with Nika Siegel, and a lot of other folks have, really, this is in a lot of people's top 10 of the last 10 years or so. This is Camille Robsis's book, Disalienation, Politics, Philosophy, and Radical Psychiatry in Post-War France. So those would be a good place to start. None of them is like laser targeted on this question of like, how do you make Marx and Freud work? Partly because like the answer is like no one has really solved that problem. But they're all, I think, going to give you really interesting ways of approaching and thinking about that question. Some of them more theoretically, some of them more practically, some of them both.
Yeah. And they're going to give you crucially like broad historical accounts and like a vivid cast of characters of different people trying to reconcile or at least work with both Marx and Freud at the same time. And as Abby just intimated, the one way to read like the history of 20th century leftism, at least in parts of the West, but also then very importantly for figures like Fanon and elsewhere, is as an attempt, for better or worse, and definitely sometimes for worse, to propitiate the impossible marriage between Marx and Freud, right? Or at least to work with a very basic fact articulated very, I think, elegantly by a friend of the podcast, Alex Colston, that what we could call like the weakest link in the body of Marx's thought is the strongest link in like the chain of psychoanalytic thought. By which Alex means, and I think this is one very helpful way of putting the problem, that like what happens in terms of the individual, in terms of their interiority, in terms of their beliefs, and then in terms of these little units that are like the family or broader ones, is where psychoanalysis really has some powerful stories to tell vis-a-vis ideas of like identification or desire or hell, even like the way our polymorphous perversity is channeled into the reproduction of the nuclear family. Those are things that, at least in certain Marxist accounts, and certainly in doctrinaire Marxist accounts, are not really of primary concern, or they're even kind of regarded as epiphenomenal. That is, they're seen as being sort of like secondary extrusions that are almost unnecessary, layered on top of what lots of Marxists will describe as just like false consciousness, right? You think you are this, but actually it's just that identification is a pure myth that's, fostered by the ideologies of capital, right?
Which doesn't mean that you don't feel it and believe it and speak it.
That's precisely the problem,
Wait,
right?
well, I mean, that is the problem with ideology. Yes.
But also like this bears even, and this is a nice parallel to what we were talking about like cure, right? And processes of cure versus symptom alleviation and what changes character, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
If false consciousness were simply a question of being an error, like a set of propositional problems.
You could just fix it.
Yeah. Thomas Frank could go to Kansas and be like, yo, what's the matter with Kansas? Here's what's the matter with Kansas. And Kansas would be like, oh, great, I'm healed. Now I'm going to vote the right way. Right? That shit doesn't work that way, right? People are attached to identifications. And a rigid distinction between base and superstructure, between the material and then like the ideological, cultural production versus how the means of production actually work, is maybe very helpful for thinking about things in terms of political economy.
Yeah.
But when it comes to libidinal economy, we have to be able to think about how people's beliefs, their desires, their unhappiness, their pleasure gets channeled into those material things. In other words, we have to think about things that kind of traverse individual and groups and the ways in which cultural production or representations in ideology kind of do have an efficacious power. And there's actually kind of a dynamic push me, pull you bootstrapping that happens between those two spaces. But again, that's not clear. It's hard to do. Yeah.
Can I just jump in and say something that I think we use this language a lot, and maybe it would be helpful just to kind of translate it, as we talk a lot about political economy and libidinal economy. And basically what we mean when we say this is we're thinking with Marx when we're talking about political economy, or when we're talking about libidinal economy, they were thinking with Freud, right? There is not, at least on this podcast, an attempt to do some sort of like overarching like 19th century German philosophy, like master theory of the world that integrates those two things. I mean, for a lot of reasons, one being, I think we are beyond the kind of cultural moment where a grand unifying theory seems either possible or desirable. But I think I just want to like be really clear about our own terms, that when we're toggling back and forth, and of course, this is a podcast about psychoanalysis, we're talking about libidinal economy. The wager that we're making is generally that if you only do that, if you linger in that register of fantasy without constant reference to material conditions, that you are going to, just as Jeremy wrote, you are going to stumble into, an unbelievable blind spot. But there's like, I guess I want to say that it's kind of like a kludge in some sort of way. It's not a theoretical solution to this problem that has bedeviled so many thinkers. I actually don't see that necessarily as a problem, because I feel rather magpie-like with respect to theoretical frameworks. I don't think that you need to be like a doctrinaire Marxist in order to be like, let's think about the material conditions that give rise to human suffering. I simply do not think that you have to do that. Likewise, I don't think you have to accept every single thing in Freud. God knows we don't. In order to say that people's cathexes and fantasies and rich dynamic inner lives are not something that we should simply dismiss as idiosyncratic and as false consciousness. So, our kludge is like the toggling back and forth. When you spend so much time thinking about fantasy, well, what happens when we try to come crashing back to reality? But if you're also just thinking in those sorts of terms, like if you, I don't want to say invalidate, but like if you give short shrift to the ways in which people understand themselves, even if you think those ways are wrong, like objectively wrong, that's going to be a problem too.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that's Abby's absolutely right. Like, we're not invested in a doctrinaire, like, psychoanalysis is this one person's thought. Like, we're not evangelists for any particular school of psychoanalysis as like the correct tradition, right? I think if you have an understanding of like the symptom as like a thing that comes about in response to certain circumstances, you could take the the existence of different schools and the work of different thinkers as being symptomatic attempts to deal with different problems that change over time.
In response to material conditions.
Yeah. What's so cool about psychoanalysis as a 20th century, at least in its beginning, sort of body of knowledge or tradition of inquiry or discursive community, many different things at once, is that it is kind of departing from this quantum problem, namely that reflecting on a thing, theorizing a thing, offering interpretations about the thing sometimes changes the thing, or the thing pushes back. The terms that you use to describe it suddenly become the ways in which the thing describes itself. And now suddenly, I'm thinking of our conversation with Lily Shirless, right? The terms that are meant to give you traction on navigating psychic suffering and material life now become the ways in which, I don't know, like Northrop Grumman is going to do its annual training, right? And suddenly you're a CIA agent with, anxiety issues, and good for you, right? The point here then is that you have to kind of stay adroit, right? You have to have a kind of stance. And for us, heuristically, you can have a kind of functional compatibilism with psychoanalysis.
That's a good way of putting it.
And Marxism, but in a way that isn't about reducing one to the other or trying to vindicate one or the other thinker. And I'll be frank about this. Sometimes I see conversations among Marxists, even quote unquote doctrinaire ones, where they talk about Marx the way many psychoanalysts used to talk about Freud, where it's like, well, if you say that slavery is not a type of capitalism, then Marx's theory of value itself no longer exists. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, what exactly is at stake in that conversation?
That was on Twitter the other day.
Yeah, and never mind that, I think you could make a very good case, how Marx himself does, about how slavery relates to capitalism. It's like, what are the fantasies or like of transmission, of the power of terms, of the cohesiveness of a body of thought that are being vindicated by that, or that are animating that? And again, what the texts that Abby just suggested do is they give a broad sweeps outline of the way in which many different thinkers have, at different points in the history of the 20th and early 21st century, tried to use Marx and Freud, respectively, to think through certain problems. And part of what that can entail sometimes are some really interesting paths not taken. Part of that can reveal like cul-de-sacs or dead ends, right? So there's a tradition, for example, after the purges, notably, and the elimination of a very interesting sort of Soviet psychoanalysis of like a Stalinist rejection of Freudianism is basically like, this is all just the bourgeoisie focusing on itself and it's too sex focused, right? Like this is just confession for people who don't believe in God. And
I mean, not wrong.
It's not wrong, but it's also, it kills the thing, it fixes the thing. And it also is kind of haunted by Freud's own anxieties about, or his own very correct diagnoses about some aspects of communism in that period. Namely, like after they kill the kulaks, they're just going to make more kulaks, right? Which is, again, you get putting these two things alongside one another, though, you get interesting things. And so just to think just off the top of my head, and you probably, better scholars of communism could talk about this in terms of like what's happening in different internationals during this period, right? You have figures like in the 1940s, Otto Fenichel, an enormously influential psychoanalyst, writes this paper, I think 42, 43, and it was only just discovered in the past 20, 30 years, I think, and a page is missing, but it's called Psychoanalysis as the Nucleus of a Future Dialectical Materialistic Psychology, right? And it's literally an attempt to reconcile many of the things we've been talking about what are the sources of suffering, and then talk about how a sufficiently Marxist psychoanalysis or a sufficiently psychoanalytic Marxism could literally change or prophylactically, is a language he uses a lot, prevent certain types of neuroses, which are understood as both individual problems and social problems. It's a really interesting text, and I get a sense from at least these questioners if they maybe want to check it out.
Yeah.
But it's then, as the century unfolds, you have different thinkers turning to Marx in different ways. And here I can think of Norman Brown or Eric Fromm or even later Deleuze, et cetera. This is why we just recommended the Rub C in particular.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk so much more about the Frankfurt School in this context too.
Trying to think about how like capitalism is producing its own set of neuroses. Or what if we think about like the capitalist subject as itself a type of neurotic? And then, you have these very interesting, this is, I think, one way to read what Zaretsky's trying to do, accounts of like why the 60s protest movement either fail in one way of thinking about it or succeed in another way of thinking about it. And how does that relate to, for example, the rejection of the idea of having a leader, right? Of killing Freud, but also maybe of opening the door for kind of incipient neoliberalism of the subject of social movements. In any event, what I would suggest for questioners is to check out those first texts, to maybe also if you have a library that has a copy of the Rutledge Handbook to Psychoanalytic Political Theory, there's some good stuff in there.
Yeah.
But to really just like emphasize use value.
That's kind of what I was going to say, is that like lurking in the background of all of these questions, I mean, not necessarily even these questions, but like folks who are invested in maybe not the possibility of a synthesis anymore, but of a rapprochement, is like this much broader question that nobody but me is going to be satisfied with, which is just like, what are the uses of theory? Right. And that has a lot to do with like, well, I don't know. What do you want to do? Right. The ways in which you're going to try to put these two thinkers next to each other, to me, has a lot to do with like what it is that you want to capture or harness, or like what is it that you want to think. And I don't think that it is a problem also to prioritize one over the other.
And I think the history of psychoanalysis and its political implications, but also its therapeutic consequence, really underscores the fact that if you don't think you have to know all the answers ahead of time, and if you're not like wedded to a kind of like a deification project for any given thinker, but you actually treat these masters of suspicion, Marx and Freud, quintessentially,
and Nietzsche, don't give him his due, please, as
kind of spurs to thinking rather than people whose thinking you have to totally validate.
Yeah, or master in order to use.
You get remarkable things, right? And this is why, we can talk about how the Oedipus structure doesn't have to be the Oedipal family. Or we can talk about how the account of polymosis perversity isn't about creating or norming as good heteropatriarchy, but rather as describing the processes by which these happen. And to be even more granular about this is why you will have a figure like Franz Fanon, right? Essentially turning to the Freudian apparatus, studying the Freudian sort of texts and critiquing them, but also structuralizing some of them and using Freud to do immanent critique of psychoanalysis. Like, this is the ways in which the Freudian project is blinkered and quintessentially European or racist or whatnot, but also gives us really good tools for an account of what's happening in his own communities, and then also that may have political consequences that are probably revolutionary. So I think, to tie a bow on this, it's this idea that it's not just about recognizing that the object of your critique or the object of your inquiry shifts as well as time passes, as history happens, as you engage it, but also that you yourself have to be able to turn that critical capacity or those tools back on yourself and on the process of thinking in a way that allows you to move. And if you're not doing any of those things, you're probably getting stuck somewhere.
We could, and probably I think will, talk more about Marx and Freud, given that there is such an appetite for it. And we haven't also really mentioned Wilhelm Reich. We are going to do some more work on Reich, and there should be some Reich episodes coming down the pike at some point. But
we'll get Reich on that.
That is, there are Marxist psychoanalysts, right? Like, it's probably important to say that, because we haven't yet. Yeah. So important to actually say that. All right. One last question. And let me just say, if you have not heard your question, it will be on next week's episode behind the paywall. There's so much more, but we're getting to them. Don't worry. Okay. Patrick put this on the outline under fun questions. Joseph writes, have you ever considered doing an episode where you perform some self-analysis or analyze one another or have a guest analyze you, re how y'all speak on the podcast? As your collective output grows, how do you feel in general about the balance or tension between being self-critical and reflective on the one hand and avoiding navel gazing on the other?
I would rather myself with on top of and that's all I'm going to say about that.
We'll say more about this behind the paywall.
Yeah.
Folks, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness and you want this second installment of episode 100, which I guess is episode 101, plus access to our whole series on the standard edition, our Wild Analysis series, our Gerontophilocracy series, and other assorted paywalled musings, or if you just want to support the podcast, which is entirely made possible by our Patreon community, head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. Thank you so much for listening.
Love you.
Here's to 100 more episodes.
Bye. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Dan Yowell. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.